In 1991, following the fall of the Soviet Union, the Republic of Chechnya declared its independence from the then newly formed Russian Federation. Located in the northern Caucasus region, near the northwestern endpoint of the Caspian Sea, Chechnya, under the Soviet Union, existed as an autonomous republic, which granted it some degree of home rule, yet not as much as Union republics such as Georgia or Armenia, who would then declare independence. As the USSR collapsed, the majority of these autonomous republics transitioned into the Russian Federation without much difficulty. This was because the Soviet legislative bodies were still able to assert control over these regions. Chechnya was the exception. Centuries of ethnic hatred and conflict between the Russians and the local Chechen population, which could be traced as far back as the 18th century, fueled the drive towards independence, a sentiment further solidified by mass deportations conducted by Stalin in the early 1940s, who exiled much of the Chechen population to Kazakhstan, Siberia, and Central Asia, under charges of collaborating with German soldiers in the 1930s. 408,000 Chechens were deported, and 200,000 would die to cold, disease, and hunger. The territory was repopulated by Russian settlers, who established Soviet institutions in the region. It was only in the 1950s, under Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, that Chechens were allowed to return to their ancestral homelands. Yet, the Chechen culture was widely suppressed. Russian settlers took over much of the land, with the Chechen language and culture being deemed uncivilized, associated with banditry and criminality. The Soviet ideas of uniformity suppressed Chechen identity over the years, leading to a unified resentment among Chechens. This anti-Soviet feeling was reinforced by the fact that the Russians controlled much of the political, social, and economic institutions in Chechnya. This meant that there was a strong desire for independence once the Soviet Union broke up. Despite sentiments by the then Russian President Boris Yeltsin for former Soviet republics to take all the sovereignty they could swallow, the Russians viewed the declaration of Chechen independence with alarm. There was fear within the Kremlin that the independence movement would threaten further successions and a breakdown in law and order in the Caucasus. This was apparent as the Chechen leader, Jokhar Dudayev, wished to create his own federation of Caucasus people. He also spoke of reincorporating Ingushetia, a neighboring region that broke away from Soviet Chechnya to become a republic in the Russian Federation. Furthermore, there was fear that economically important republics within Russia, such as Tatarstan and regions east of the Ural Mountains, might have also sought independence. This was made clear when, in 1992, Moscow had to make concessions to Tatarstan to prevent it from seceding, after it voted to do so in a referendum. Yeltsin feared Chechen independence would set a precedent for other republics within the Russian Federation to pursue independence. There was also the vital Baku-Novorossiysk oil pipeline that ran through Chechnya, which Russia feared could be at risk of destruction or oil tapping due to the criminality in the area. Moscow also feared that Chechnya might form trade agreements with Georgia or Turkey, to which they had firm connections, which could potentially disrupt their own business with the pipeline. It is important to mention that the Russian economy was itself in a poor state, and Yeltsin was becoming increasingly unpopular at home. Therefore, the Russian president needed to show that Moscow could not be challenged without consequence, and a decisive success in the Caucasus had the potential to shore up support domestically. The Russians first attempted to overthrow the incumbent Chechen government in late November of 1994. The then Chechen president, Jokhar Dudayev, had come to power in a coup in 1991, exiling the Soviet-appointed leader, Doku Zagayev, to Moscow. Under his leadership, organised crime and high-level government corruption was rampant. Dadayev even dissolved the Chechen parliament in 1993, after a no-confidence vote in his leadership. Yet his regime proved stronger than the Russians anticipated. Moscow attempted to rally Chechen opposition against him in a coup that ultimately failed. Although the Kremlin Defense Secretary, Pavel Grachev, tried to deny any involvement, Dadayev's forces captured Russian soldiers that were among the opposition, claiming to be mercenaries, and paraded them on national television. This more secretive method of reasserting federal control was done because of Yeltsin's reluctance to engage the Chechens openly. It is possible that he doubted the success of direct intervention, since he stated once that such action was absolutely impossible. Yeltsin believed that he could utilize internal opposition to Dadayev's rule through the Russian-backed Provisional Chechen Council to achieve military success by proxy. However, after this attempt to overthrow Dadayev ended in disaster, it was clear that waging war by proxy was not a viable solution. Yeltsin decided to escalate and began moving soldiers into Chechnya on the 11th of December of that same year, the official reason being to re-establish constitutional order, the main target being the capital of Chechnya, the city of Grozny. Grozny covers over 100 square miles and was home to an estimated 490,000 residents in 1994, and acted as the regional capital during Soviet times. Back then, the city was composed of industrial sites and multi-story buildings, similar to other cities within the Soviet Union. Perhaps due to the Soviet Union's successful use of tanks in the Czech Republic during the 1968 uprising, as well as faulty reconnaissance and intelligence gathering from the start, the Russians made several flawed assumptions. They assumed the seizure of the capital would put an end to the war, that surrounding and capturing the city would take around 7 days, and that the Chechen force would not be able to put up serious resistance. Yet these assumptions failed to consider some key factors. While it is true that Dadayev had failed to create a unified standing army in Chechnya, with the defending force being made up of a number of small and disparate units, most of the fighters present in Grozny had served with the Soviet armed forces, many in elite units such as the VDV and Spetsnaz. They spoke Russian, and were well aware of the tactics and weaknesses of their adversaries as a result. Unlike their Russian counterparts, the Chechens were well aware of the layout of Grozny. This meant they could more easily navigate through the back alleys, sewers, and passages to create ambushes throughout the city. The structure of the Chechen forces in Grozny was less hierarchical than what is typically seen in most armies, with most Chechen units being made up of various different groups that operated with relative independence of each other. This can be explained by Chechnya's ancient system of clans or teeps, which divided groups of Chechens by geographical and ethnic boundaries. Historically, many of these tribes would come into contact with each other, with the concept of blood feud and adat, an eye for an eye, being well ingrained in Chechen culture. This means that without a unifying enemy to defeat, and a figure such as Dadayev to rally behind, Chechnya was politically divided, with each teep managing its own affairs, even if they were unified by identity, language, culture, and a predominantly Muslim faith. The Chechen teep, which brought together 2 or 3 villages, could each produce around 600 men, which would be divided down into groups of 25. These were broken down further into squads, which would typically be composed of 10 or 8 men, although some groups were less large. Despite the more decentralized nature of the Chechen fighters, they were disciplined and well coordinated in their efforts, and there was still a command structure. The Chechen Chief of Staff, Aslan Maskhadov, led the defense of Grozny, his headquarters located in the basement of the presidential palace, located in the heart of the city. Another notable leader was the field commander, Shamil Basayev, who commanded the Abkhaz battalion, who would later become infamous for committing acts of terror inside Russia. The Chechens communicated using Nokia and Motorola radios, which enabled the fighters to coordinate their attacks. This was helped by the fact that the Russians did not speak Chechen, which meant their communications could not be understood, even if their opponents listened in on their transmissions. The Chechens also had access to Russian army radios, which allowed them to listen in on their adversaries' comms, as well as allowing them to transmit false information to the Russians. Their own security was also fortified, as the information was passed between them on a strictly need-to-know basis. Furthermore, while the Chechen fighters would lack the heavy weapons or air support the Russians had, in the chaos of the Soviet breakup, Grozny had become awash with small arms weapons left over from that era. That, plus the rampant criminality, meant weapons such as AK assault rifles, anti-tank rocket-propelled grenades, SVD sniper rifles, and machine guns were plentiful, as was the ammunition required. The rocket-propelled grenade, or RPG, proved to be one of the most feared weapons in the fighting due to the variety of ways it could be used for both anti-infantry and anti-tank use. Each group of fighters would carry at least 1 or 2 RPGs, as well as a light machine gun. This would also be backed up by either a single or 2 sniper rifles, while the remaining men carried AK assault rifles. The Chechens did have a few scattered T-72, T-54 and T-62 tanks, but they were small in number and obsolete. The Chechens used their tanks to cover vital intersections and streets, utilizing them as static pillboxes. The Russians presumed that with Grozny being Chechnya's main political, economic and cultural center, its seizure could secure them a quick victory. Yet this analysis failed to consider the Chechens' strong national desire for independence. Faulty intelligence led the Russian Defense Secretary, Pavel Grachev, to believe the Chechens were lightly armed, and that resistance would dissipate as soon as armoured convoys approached. Yet the Chechens, who were fighting on their home territory, believed in the cause they were fighting for, and were prepared and willing to fight the Russians. The Russian army that entered Grozny, while formidable on paper, was a chronically underfunded force, possessing only 30 to 40% of the budget and supplies it needed to maintain itself. This was primarily because the economy of the Federation was in dire straits. This led to many Russian soldiers lacking food or appropriate gear to deal with the cold winter temperatures. Furthermore, the Russian soldiers sent into Grozny were poorly paid conscripts, who lacked any specialized training in urban warfare. This might seem strange considering the great Soviet victories in cities such as Stalingrad and Berlin. However, in the early 1990s, barely any of the departments involved in the Battle of Grozny had troops that were trained to operate in urban environments. This was because, by the end of the Cold War, it was expected that future conflicts would predominantly take place in more open terrain in Eastern Europe, and combat in cities would be on a more limited scale to what was seen in Grozny, with an emphasis on counter-terrorism. Soviet doctrine suggested that an enemy would rather fight in the open, opposed to having its urban settlements destroyed. If a city was defended, the Soviets dictated it should be avoided. Therefore, training in urban warfare, no longer the predominant focus, atrophied, and was confined primarily to elite VDV and Spetsnaz units. Furthermore, the lack of resources and funding meant that from 1992 to 1994, under 25% of the required training exercises on a company, regimental, and battalion level had been completed. This meant that the Russian army from the operational level all the way down to the individual soldier, lacked competency in even basic combat skills. In addition, due to a shortage of available manpower, nearly a third of the Russian soldiers had criminal records and had poor physical and mental health. For junior officers in the Russian army, urban warfare was only mentioned briefly in their training, and the infantry that was sent into Grozny had practically no knowledge or experience on how to fight effectively in cities. Due to President Yeltsin's desire for rapid and decisive action, the preparation for the assault on Grozny was also extremely rushed. As a result, unit cohesion was poor, with very few of the soldiers actually having trained together prior to the operation. This was because the Russian force sent into the city was composed of hastily assembled ad hoc units, a consequence of the lack of resources and manpower. The lack of funding meant that none of the regiments involved were at full strength. The lower-ranking leadership, which is seen as the backbone in Western armies, was also sparse. For example, sergeants were themselves conscripts, with only a little more training than their subordinates, and lacked frontline experience. The lack of qualified non-commissioned officers and junior officers was a problem, because it meant that the Russian units on the ground lacked clear leadership and direction at the front. This issue was compounded by widespread hazing conducted by these inexperienced NCOs, which led to an overall lowering of morale amongst the soldiers. Yeltsin's fear about other semi-autonomous republics in Russia breaking away meant the planning for the assault on Grozny took place within a few days. As a result, the Russians did not have time to gather the intelligence needed for the operation, including an accurate description of the city's layout. Few aerial reconnaissance missions were conducted prior to the assault, and the Russians switched off their satellites to save money. There was also little intelligence from the air. This meant that the troops lacked detailed maps of Grozny, which resulted in the Russian forces becoming disorientated inside the city. The Russian infantry moved around in armoured personnel carriers, or infantry fighting vehicles, such as the BMP-2, and was backed up with the T-72 and T-80 tanks. The tanks were not ideally suited to urban warfare, in part due to the fact that they often lacked specialised explosive reactive armour, designed to protect against RPGs. The troops often had little knowledge as to how to use their weapons properly, when to use them, or what the rules of engagement were. In fact, half of those sent to Grozny had never fired live shells from their tanks in training. Some of the younger soldiers had never even fired their rifles prior to the assault, and as a result of a lack of training exercises, none of the troops had been able to practice on a firing range since 1992. This was made worse by the fact that the rules of engagement were often impractical, namely the ruling that fire should only be sent forth if the Russian troops were shot at first. All these factors contributed to a low level of professionalism overall, as well as poor coordination between units. The tanks, infantry, and APCs had never trained or worked together prior to the operation, which would lead to sluggish reactions from the Russians during the fighting. This was made worse by the fact that the Russians lacked trained crew members to operate these armoured vehicles. This meant a single person had to carry out dual roles, like a commander having to act as a gunner. However, the Russians did possess a high level of artillery, as well as superiority in the air. This advantage in raw firepower meant the Chechens would have little chance if they engaged the Russians in open terrain. The final major issue faced by the Russians in the planning phase was the number of departments involved, which comprised of the Ministry of Defence, Federal Counterintelligence or FSK, Border Guards, and Internal Affairs or MVD. There were also various forces involved, which included airborne, Spetsnaz, and ground troops. None of these forces or government departments were able to effectively work in tandem, primarily due to a lack of experience doing so. This was further complicated by the number of commanders in the field, representing each department, which confused the planning and decision-making. Due to oftentimes differing protocols regarding communication, the different departments were often unable to share intelligence or troop locations. This led to a lack of trust and friction between the agencies, as well as overcomplicated command and control protocols, which prevented a unified effort in the fighting. Defense Minister Grachev had full control over all the departments in what was an interagency operation. He tried to unify all the different forces and agencies by utilizing the command structure of the North Caucasus Military District, or NCMD. However, the NCMD lacked experience in coordinating a joint operation involving multiple agencies, as well as the means to accommodate the interior troops. The Russians chose to assault Grozny with unsecured radio channels, whereby the troops would communicate in uncoded language. This was because there was a lack of encryptable radios in the army, and the Russians lacked the time to train their troops with the comms equipment available. This meant the Chechens could listen in on their transmissions and, as mentioned, broadcast false information to them. The urban landscape of Grozny, including the high-rise buildings and power cables, also interfered with their radio comms, which would prevent the Russians from calling in accurate airstrikes and artillery. The lack of radio antennae and repeaters was to blame for this. All this meant that the Russian army was simply in no fit state to wage an intense urban conflict at that time. With the assumption that taking the capital would put an end to the war, the initial plan was a simple drive to Grozny, in which it would be surrounded. The Russians hoped that the initial show of force would push Dadaev to negotiate peace terms, and if not, would position their forces to attack Grozny. This operation would involve the MVD, Armed Forces and FSB, with some border forces. While the MVD and border guards would seize control over the countryside and surround Chechnya, the armed forces would attack the city from multiple directions, the main targets being key areas such as the presidential palace, the main railway station, the TV and radio stations, as well as the police station, which the Russians believed were vital areas for the separatist movement to function. The Russians believed the seizure of these areas would take 4 days to complete, and would force Dadaev into peace talks. The incursion into Chechnya itself composed of 3 axes of advance. One was from the northwest, out of a Russian military base in Mozdok. Another would drive out of Kizlyar from the east. The final advance would come from Vladikavkaz, North Ossetia, from the west. The drive to Grozny immediately faced difficulties, since the Russian units faced sporadic armed resistance from the local population, which served to confuse and delay the advance. This was because the Russians were unsure what to do in the face of non-violent civilian actions. Many Chechens simply stood in front of the Russian convoys, and they often ground to a halt as a result. Furthermore, the poor quality roads and difficult weather conditions meant that the Russians had to advance towards the outskirts of Grozny along multiple differing routes, and failed to keep the schedule. This delay meant the city was not effectively blockaded, especially from the south, which allowed the Chechens to bring reinforcements into the city and fortify its defences. It was not until December the 26th, 1994, that the Russians were able to surround Grozny. This meant that the drive to Grozny was weeks behind schedule. Even then, the Chechens were still able to resupply the city throughout the battle, which was the result of the blockade still being relatively porous in nature. The Russians justified this, stating that it allowed refugees to vacate the city. While the Russians had assumed the Chechens would be lightly armed, they had in fact turned much of the centre of Grozny into a nest of ad hoc defences. The heavily urbanised area was fortified with sandbags and reinforced to allow for firing positions. Defence points included choke points such as a bridge over the Sunza River, as well as the area south of the centre of Grozny, Minutka Square. Furthermore, the reinforcements meant the Chechens had a numerical advantage compared to the first wave of the Russian assault force. This was a problem, since given the advantages urban terrain has to the defender, it is generally advisable the attacking force has a numerical advantage of 3-1, with some US analysts even arguing a 6-1 advantage is required. The Russian Air Force had started making incursions into Chechnya before the ground attack, between November the 29th and December the 2nd, 1994. These attacks successfully destroyed all 266 combat planes the Chechens had, due to attacks on the two airports present in Grozny. This meant the Russian superiority in the air was assured, as the Chechens had little or no air defence. The Air Force bombed the TV tower in Grozny, as well as other airports throughout Chechnya. In addition, roads, bridges, and a tank repair workshop were also targeted. Even though the Russians effectively controlled the skies over Chechnya, the bombing campaign was indiscriminate in nature, which caused considerable collateral damage. This was primarily due to the Russians' lack of precision-guided weapons, and the expense required to use them. Civilians in Grozny, including many ethnic Russians living in the city, often bore the brunt of these attacks, suffering high casualties. As a result, the air campaign strengthened the Chechens' resolve to fight, and removed any lingering support the Russians had in Chechnya, and ultimately failed to disperse the rebels. When the Russian forces entered Grozny, they planned to advance along 4 different axes, which would ultimately attempt to converge on the presidential palace located in the city centre. These forward assault formations were known as storm detachments. Lieutenant General Konstantin Pulikovsky would assault Grozny from the north. From the south, Major General Ivan Barbachev would move to seal off the city centre, after moving along railway tracks on to the west and seizing the main railway station. Major General Nikolai Staskov would attack from the east, towards the central area of Lenin Square, along the railway line, with the goal of capturing the main bridge over the Sunza River. Lieutenant General Rokhlin would seize the central hospital from the northeast, where he could support the other axes of advance. The 76th and 106th Airborne Divisions would support the operation by attempting to prevent Chechen rebels from attacking from behind, or firing on the oil refineries and chemical works in the city. The armoured columns were to completely isolate the centre of Grozny, trapping and isolating Tadaev in that area, as well as his forces, who the Russians assumed would be there. The operation would be supported by helicopter-deployed Spetsnaz Special Forces troops, who had the task of disrupting Chechen forces south of the city. The Russians began their assault on Grozny on New Year's Day 1994, after artillery and airstrikes. The Chechens divided the defending groups between different districts of the city, and allowed the Russians to enter the more fortified areas near the centre of Grozny. The initial Russian advance met little resistance in some areas, which drew them in. The defenders relied on ambushes within Grozny to achieve success. The Chechens deployed on parallel streets, in which 6 or 7 man teams would hide in the middle and lower floors of the multi-storey buildings, which included the commanders. These units would cover only one side of the street to prevent friendly fire incidents, and to give themselves a way to retreat. 2 additional 25-man teams hid in the basements of buildings, which marked the point of entry to the area of ambush. These were designed to trap the convoys and act as potential reinforcements for the other Chechen groups if they were needed. Snipers provided additional support, and were used to target Russian infantrymen on foot. Operating within the middle and lower floors of multi-storey buildings gave the Chechens protection from Russian artillery and airstrikes that came from above. which were made less affected by the heavily urbanized environment. The Chechens also reinforced their positions by mining the points of entry to buildings, meaning the Russians could not enter for cover when the ambush occurred. Harsh weather conditions, namely a thick fog that blanketed parts of the city, also hampered support from the air. This was because visibility was poor, which prevented the helicopters delivering accurate airstrikes. Furthermore, Chechen fighters would often disguise themselves as Red Cross workers or civilians. This meant some fighters were able to lure the disorientated Russians into places of ambush by pretending to be helpful guides through the city. The Chechens would alert each other to the oncoming convoys by use of the Motorola radios. The defenders targeted and destroyed the front and rear vehicles of the convoy, which effectively trapped the Russians in the narrow streets. The Chechens would use a tactic called hugging, in which they would engage the Russians at a distance of between 50 to 250 meters. This meant the Russians could not utilize their artillery or air power. Out of fear, the strikes would hit their own troops. The Chechens, being familiar with Russian hardware, would target the engines and fuel cells of the attacking vehicles. The defenders would attack the Russian tanks from the rear, top and sides, where the armor of the vehicle was weakest. It required around 3 to 6 RPG hits to destroy a tank, and careful targeting helped to minimize the ammunition use. The RPG's effectiveness was also enhanced by the use of multiple teams attacking at once, which meant one could fire as the other reloaded, and the RPG holder recovered from the deafening backblast of the weapon. The defenders also utilized jellied fuel and gasoline to burn Russian vehicles as they passed ambush sites. Furthermore, the fact that the fighters hid in basements meant the Russian tanks could not depress their guns low enough to fire back at the Chechens. The problem was made worse by inexperienced tank gunners, who became confused and unsure where to shoot due to the overwhelming amount of fire they received. Inexperienced Russian troops chose to stay inside their vehicles, where they falsely assumed that they would be safe, and were burned alive when their transports were destroyed. Chechen snipers and machine gunners were also a major threat to the Russian forces. One tactic employed by the snipers was to shoot the legs of an enemy soldier and fire upon the injured man's comrades as they tried to help. The Russian troops died in their hundreds. Neither the eastern or western convoys reached their targets in the city centre, as both became entangled by fierce Chechen resistance, traffic jams and friendly fire incidents. Chechen resistance forced the eastern group to detour, in which they became bogged down in heavy street-on-street fighting as well as minefields. Furthermore, there were numerous blue-on-blue incidents that occurred. In one instance, the 104th Airborne Division, that was heading the eastern advance, was hit with an airstrike. This friendly fire incident resulted in 5 vehicles being destroyed, and was the result of both poor communication as well as bad weather. Communication quickly broke down among the attacking convoys, with individual Russian units not knowing the progress of other units. It is claimed around 60% of the Russian casualties occurred through friendly fire incidents. Inexperienced and poorly trained troops would often fire blindly in a panic at anything that moved, meaning they were just as likely to hit a fellow Russian as they were a Chechen fighter. The smoke, fire, and general disorientation the Russians had entering the city contributed to this friendly fire. Furthermore, as a result of these conditions, the night vision equipment provided proved to be ineffective in mitigating the low visibility. The Russians did have some initial success with their northern advance. The 131st Independent Motor Rifle, or Maykop Brigade, which led the Northern Army Group, was able to secure the railway station, a target originally meant for the western units, and park its armoured vehicles outside the presidential palace in the main square. The only resistance to the northern advance faced was a Chechen outpost, which they were able to successfully bypass. It is possible the relative initial success the northern advance had was due to them catching the Chechens by surprise. Aslan Maskhadov himself stated that the manner in which the Russian vehicles were parked outside the presidential palace was reminiscent of a parade, since they lacked any protection from infantry and were effectively sitting ducks. When the Chechen commander gave the order to counterattack, they destroyed much of the Russian armour within the first hour, and even wounded the brigade commander, Colonel Savin, in the legs. Even though the initial advance had been successful, the Russian MVD and airborne forces were unable to clear the buildings and consolidate the Russian gains as planned. This was because the Chechen strongpoints had not been neutralized in the first assault, meaning the lead battalions became cut off and surrounded. Savin realized towards the end of the day that neither the western or eastern advances were available to help. Russian losses were mounting, and ammunition was running short. Elements of the western advance, namely the 19th Motor Rifle Division, were able to get within 300 meters of the presidential palace and potentially relieve the Maikop Brigade, but they were bloodily repulsed by the Chechens and were forced to detour just north of the palace to an area known as Lenin Park, leaving them in no position to rescue the trapped brigade. Another element of the Northern Army Group, the 81st Motor Rifle Regiment, was also heavily attacked after reaching its objective, that being a blocking position north of the palace. The armoured column of the regiment, like the 131st, was cut off when the rear and front vehicles were hit, and its commander, Colonel Yaroslavets, was wounded. The bulk of the 81st Motor Rifle Regiment's vehicles were destroyed in the streets of Grozny, yet the deputy commander, Colonel Stankiewicz, was able to take charge over the survivors, who were then able to fight their way back to Russian lines. Regarding the 131st, a rescue attempt led by Colonel Savin's deputy brigade commander, who led around 40 vehicles, was made. This failed, as much of the convoy was destroyed by Chechen ambushes upon reaching the railway station, where the 131st was taking cover. Attempts by the 106th and the 76th Parachute Regiments also failed to reach the railway station, since the routes leading into the area were now controlled by the Chechens. Lieutenant General Rukhlin authorized Savin to launch a breakout attempt towards Lenin Park. In desperation, Savin and the surviving members tried to move out on foot, abandoning the railway station, but due to the lack of maps became lost and moved too close to the palace. The 131st Maikop Brigade was effectively wiped out. Savin and his brigade staff were killed in the fighting, as were the rest of the survivors, apart from the 74 men who were captured. Vehicle losses were heavy as well, 20 out of 26 tanks, and 102 out of 120 infantry fighting vehicles. The overall losses for the Russians amounted to over 1,000 men killed, 84 men captured in total, as well as over 200 armoured vehicles destroyed. The Spetsnaz units, located south of the city, surrendered to the Chechens after becoming disorientated and operating for several days without food. The initial assault on Grozny had been a terrible defeat for the Russians, and would force them to reassess and change their approach. After the first Russian attack ended in defeat, the only grouping left in Grozny proper that was still in good order was General Rukhlin's northeastern group. This was because that grouping had not been expected to drive into the city centre, and was thus able to dig in and avoid the disasters around the presidential palace. There was a mutual ceasefire that occurred between the 10th and the 12th of January, in which the Chechens and the Russians exchanged casualties and prisoners. Even though the initial assault on Grozny had ended in disaster, the Russians were able to adapt under fire. The first change made was with regards to leadership. 4 commanding generals were relieved of command, including Stazkov, who commanded the eastern advance. Furthermore, the Russian troop morale was collapsing, and much of the officer corps were on the verge of mutiny, refusing to follow orders. The northeastern and the surviving northern groupings converged under Rukhlin's command, and the Russian forces were reorganized into joint groupings commanded by Rokhlin, General Babich, and General Popov. General Rokhlin's new approach was inspired by the same tactics used by the Soviets to take Berlin in 1945. This took a more methodical approach than before, and sought to seize Grozny district by district and house by house, with the use of heavy artillery and air bombardment. The Russian infantry was boosted by reinforcements, which included 7 battalions of naval infantry and additional Spetsnaz units. These troops were better trained than those that composed the ad hoc units sent in during the first wave. They also helped to swell the ranks of the Russian infantry, so they had a clear numerical advantage over the rebels in the city. That the Russians were able to bring in reinforcements, as well as an additional 90 tons of ammunition to the fight in such a short period, was a feat of logistics. The effectiveness of the Russian infantry was also improved when secure voice transmitters were used. This, as well as increased caution when using communications equipment, meant the Russians' transmissions would not be as easily targeted as they were in the New Year's assault. With better trained troops and more secure communications, the Russians learned how to more effectively seize the multi-story buildings around Grozny. The Russians learned how to better coordinate with their artillery and air support assets, and were reorganized into smaller and more mobile assault squads. These smaller groupings were supported by snipers employed by the MVD and FSB, which substituted the poorly trained ones used by the MOD. Fire support was provided by tanks, which were used more cautiously than during the New Year's Eve assault. Instead of leading convoys, the tanks moved behind the attacking naval infantry so as to stay out of the RPG's firing range, while also being able to utilize their main guns more effectively, firing and hitting enemy targets from much further distances. The Russians also utilized self-propelled anti-aircraft weapon systems such as the 2S-6 Tunguska and the ZSU-23-4. These were effective as they could depress or elevate their weapons more than the main guns on the tanks, allowing them to more effectively hit the Chechen firing squads hiding in the buildings and basements. They weren't invulnerable though, since all the self-propelled AA guns the 131st Mykop possessed had been destroyed in the fighting. Harking back to Soviet tactics used in World War II, the Russians methodically cleared each room of each building, using their more mobile assault squads, and advanced slowly. The Russians did this by throwing grenades through doors and windows. Mortars and handheld RPO A-Shmel flamethrowers were also used to destroy Chechen snipers and defensive positions. The flamethrowers proved to be particularly effective, since the warheads they carried used a thermobaric incendiary mixture that detonated inside the buildings with a cloud of intense heat and overpressure, which creates comparable results to a 152mm artillery round. After clearing the building, the Russians would mine and booby-trap the entrances and underground passageways to that structure to prevent the Chechens recapturing the buildings with counterattacks. Despite these changes, the Russians still struggled to distinguish Chechen fighters from civilians, which led them to checking to see if a person had bruises on the shoulder or singed hair, a sign of frequent RPG use. There were also still issues with coordination between units as well as unit cohesion, since despite the addition of more experienced troops, the Russians were still mostly an inexperienced and poorly trained force. Yet the change in approach did yield results, and even though they continued to suffer heavy losses, Russian casualties were never as high as they were during the New Year's Eve assault, although due to the usage of massed artillery and airstrikes, the civilians present inside the city continued to suffer greatly in the fighting. The Russians, under the command of General Rokhlin, managed to steadily move from the north down towards the presidential palace. By the 14th of January, the Russian Northern Group successfully broke through to the city centre with the help of its air power. The presidential palace itself was subject to artillery fire, tank fire, as well as airstrikes, which included bunker-busting bombs, which destroyed several floors of the building. In the wake of this overwhelming fire, the Chechen commanders made the decision to retreat into Grozny's suburbs on the 18th of January. With the now ruined palace in Russian hands, Boris Yeltsin declared the military operation in Grozny was over. This announcement was premature, however, since the Chechens at this point were still in control over key crossings over the Sunza River, as well as the eastern, western, and southern districts of the city. At this point, the Russians only really controlled about a third of Grozny, mainly in the north and around the railway station. Fighting escalated as President Dudayev rallied the Chechen fighters, particularly around the southern areas of the city, including Minutka Square, as well as the river crossings. Aslan Muskadov himself described how after this development, his Chechens quickly set up defences along the Sunza River and guarded each river crossing with between 10 and 15 men, while he himself set up a new headquarters in the town hospital. The river dividing Grozny became a key battleground, and it would take the Russians near a month to break through the Chechen defences. The Russians at this stage controlled the left bank and the Chechens controlled the right. One of Muskadov's aides, a man called Hussein Ishkanov, explained how the rebels attempted to destroy all the bridges across the river, but lacked the explosives needed to do so. Muskadov argued that the Russians were afraid to cross the bridges during this period, so destroyed practically every building in the city using heavy artillery. Victory in the battle came to the Russians when, on the 3rd of February, they successfully managed to breach Chechen defences in the south, which cut the rebels' lines of communication. Rukhlin, at this stage, had set up his headquarters, as well as those of special battalions and intelligence units, in the basements of damaged buildings. This was an improvement over the initial advance because Rukhlin was able to better communicate with the intelligence agencies. This allowed the Russians to operate more effectively, since the leadership were given up-to-date information. Muskadov himself claimed the Russians came within 200 meters of his headquarters after they successfully managed to cross the river, and despite counter-attacking with all his remaining forces, was unable to halt the Russian onslaught, which forced him to withdraw to the city's outskirts. By the 9th of February, Muskadov announced that he would withdraw from the city. Arguably, this outcome was already inevitable by the end of January, due to the overwhelming amount of firepower that had been brought to bear by the Russians. However, the Russians were only able to gain complete control over Grozny by March the 7th, after the remaining fighters under Shamil Basayev withdrew completely. The Battle of Grozny was over. Despite seizing the city of Grozny after months of heavy fighting, the war in Chechnya did not end with its capture. Russian control over Grozny would remain tenuous throughout the First Chechen War. In May 1995, the Russians were forced to introduce curfews, admitting that there were rebel fighters that had infiltrated the city. Grozny itself was a ruin at this point, with an estimated 35,000 of its population being killed in the fighting. The partially destroyed presidential palace, the headquarters of Muskadov, was demolished. The Chechen War became a protracted guerrilla war, with the Russians being reluctant to storm Chechnya's other main settlements east of Grozny, those being Gurdomez and Argun, though these cities came under Russian control by the end of April, albeit tenuously. Throughout May, the Russians, according to Colonel General Mikhail Yegorov, controlled about 80% of Chechnya, with the rebels primarily being situated around the southern highlands. By June, it was stated that the Chechens only had control over a small region in the south, leading some to think the war would soon be over. However, the Russians were never able to fully control the countryside, lacking enough men or morale to patrol the areas outside the cities. This loose control over the countryside allowed the Chechens to regroup and reorganize in order to launch successful attacks inside Russia. Chechen commanders such as Shamil Basayev and Salman Raduev were able to independently seize control of Russian territory while being able to escape through the use of mass hostage-taking. In one instance, in June 1995, Shamil Basayev, after spending the equivalent of $9,000 bribing Russian border guards, was able to take control over a hospital in the Russian town Budyonnovsk, located 70 miles north of the Chechen border, and took around 1,800 hostages, threatening to shoot them if his demands were not met. The Russians, despite storming the building, resulting in the deaths of 147 hostages, were unable to end the crisis by force. A temporary ceasefire was agreed, and Basayev was able to return to Chechnya. By the end of 1995, Raduev was able to recapture much of Gerdemers, considered at this point to be under firm Russian control. After a 2-week battle involving the use of artillery strikes on the city, the Russians chose to negotiate, and Raduev was able to withdraw from the city unimpeded. In January 1996, Raduev struck again, and was able to seize control over the Dagestani town of Pervomoskoye. After taking hostages, the Russians would again respond with heavy bombardments, claiming the hostages taken were dead already. The Chechens were able to break through the Russian lines and retreat successfully. Raduev himself would only be captured in the year 2000. These victories by the Chechens, as well as the indiscriminate Russian bombardments, fueled the resistance movement, which meant the conflict continued to drag on. The Russians were able to kill Dadaev in April 1996 after a guided missile was able to lock on to his satellite phone. This also failed to end the war, and Dadaev himself had done little to aid the war effort at this point, and had failed to secure peace with the Russians. Muskadov, who had led the defense of Grozny, was seen as the natural successor, and the Chechens turned to him for leadership. Seeing how Raduev's and Dadaev's actions had brought the Russians to the negotiating table, Muskadov looked to launch an operation into Grozny to bring about an end to the war. By this point, the Russians had fewer forces in Chechnya's capital. Shifting their focus and looking to seize control of Chechen strongpoints south of the country. Believing victory was within reach, Boris Yeltsin also began to draw down the number of troops present in Chechnya, meaning the forces within Grozny were reduced further. This drawdown was in part a product of the unpopularity of the war in Russia, as well as Boris Yeltsin's declining approval ratings in the polls, despite being re-elected. Muskadov's forces were able to move into Grozny in 25-man groups undetected. The Russians had left the MVD in charge of the administration building, who were poorly trained in positional street fighting and lacked the manpower to properly secure the city, which allowed the Chechens to infiltrate the capital. This decision by the MOD to hand over towns to the NVD came about due to its belief that internal problems are not within its remit, hence its reluctance to remain in newly seized urban settlements within Chechnya. This was also a byproduct of the uncertainty seen at the start of the war as to how the MOD and NVD should support each other. In August 1996, just days before President Yeltsin was to be inaugurated, the Chechens launched a surprise attack on the MVD units inside Grozny, catching them unprepared. Led by Shamil Basayev, the Chechens were able to seal off the 3 main entrances to the city and recaptured most of the key districts. Panicked and in disarray, the Russians were besieged inside their bases, posts, as well as the FSB and MVD headquarters in the city centre, taking heavy casualties. The MOD forces, based in the suburb of Kalanka, launched a counterattack on the second day, hoping to relieve the besieged MVD units. The Russians appeared to have learned nothing from the First Battle of Grozny, since the troops who were involved in that operation had gone home. The MOD forces had poor maps and, like in the First Battle of Grozny, lost many of their vehicles to ambushes in the narrow streets. The helicopters also proved to be of limited use, like in the first battle, and one even managed to strike the MVD headquarters by accident. It was only on the fifth day that units of the 276th Motor Rifle Regiment were able to break through to the city centre to relieve the MVD trapped there. This was done with the support of artillery firing from the Kankala suburb. While the Russians were able to evacuate the wounded, 150 men died in the rescue attempt, and most of the city remained in rebel hands. The Russians were unable to fully recapture Grozny, despite being on the cusp of launching a heavy artillery bombardment. This was because the war was becoming increasingly unpopular inside Moscow. The secretary of the Russian Security Council, Alexander Lebed, a veteran VDV commander, flew to Dagestan and then travelled to Chechnya, ordering Russian troops to stand down. With the war dragging on and becoming increasingly unpopular, especially after the rebels retook Grozny, Lebed began a dialogue with Maskhadov. By the 30th of August, the talks had ended and the Hazav-Yurt Accord was signed. This was overseen by the security-orientated intergovernmental agency, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. While preventing outright independence, it gave the Chechens an unprecedented degree of autonomy within the Federation, and the Russians had pulled their forces out entirely by the end of 1996. With the Hazav-Yurt Accord assigned, the First Chechen War had ended, and Aslan Maskhadov was elected president in 1997. Yet, tragically, this ultimately failed to end the violence, and in 1999, the Second Chechen War began.